Welcome to Global Connections with Robert Siegel, navigating the new normal, presented by the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. Our monthly Leaders Forum addresses vital issues facing society and technology, real estate and medicine, technology and science. My name is Dr. Joshua Cloud. I'm the Executive Director of American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, AFRMC, a 501c3 national American charitable organization based in New York City. We at AFRMC represent Israel's premier hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petah Tikva in Greater Tel Aviv, the leading institution named in honor of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. The hospital is a motto of coexistence, as it serves 1 million patients annually from all ethnic and religious backgrounds with the same compassionate care. Please support our mission in this free public affairs program with a donation of any amount. Visit us, American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, online and donate at afrmc.org. Join us on social media, on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook. We depend on you, our audience's support, to help the hospital in Israel. So thank you if you can contribute any amount. Our host and moderator for Global Connections is Robert Siegel, former host of All Things Considered on National Public Radio for 31 years. Over the course of an hour each month, Global Connections features guests who Robert Siegel interviews as they explore important issues in our world. Today's Global Connections topic is American Antisemitism Today. Thank you to our very special guests, Mark Oppenheimer, journalist and author of the recent book Squirrel Hill, The Tree of Life Synagogue Shooting and the Soul of a Neighborhood. Dara, author of the recent book People Love Dead Jews. And Rabbi David Sandmel, chair of the International Jewish Committee for Interreligious Consultations. And now, Global Connections with Robert Siegel.
The Anti-Defamation League recently published a survey of anti-Semitic attitudes in America. The ADL has been doing it for decades. And this time, the survey found a sharp increase over just the past 3 years in the numbers of Americans who agree with various negative statements about Jews. The ADL's findings come at a time when the country has witnessed some notorious violent attacks on synagogues and Jews. Reports of harassment of Orthodox Jews who are easily identified by their dress have risen. The remarks of Ye, the rapper formerly known as Kanye West, and the video endorsed by basketball star Kyrie Irving have made headlines about anti-Semitism. Not surprisingly, a survey a year ago found that 90% of American Jews are concerned about anti-Semitism. On the other hand, these days, there is virtually no quarter of American life off limits to Jews. There is no contemporary equivalent of Father Charles Coughlin, the anti-Semite radio priest, he was called. It's estimated that his weekly broadcast was heard by a quarter of American households. Anti-Semitism is not a feature of mainline politics in America, mainstream politics, but it is certainly alive on the fringes, and social media have made this the golden age of the fringe. Why is anti-Semitism on the rise, and what should we do about it? Now, those are the overarching questions for our three panelists, whom I'll talk with one-on-one, and then we'll have a question and answer session. Our first panelist is journalist and author Mark Oppenheimer. Mark used to write the Beliefs column in the New York Times. He is host and writer of the podcast Gatecrashers, The Hidden History of Ivy League Jews, and he's the author of the book Squirrel Hill, The Tree of Life Synagogue Shooting and the Soul of a Neighborhood. Tree of Life was, of course, the scene of the 2018 attack in Pittsburgh that claimed 11 lives, the deadliest attack ever on the American Jewish community. Mark Oppenheimer, welcome. And thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
In your book about Squirrel Hill, you quote the then editor of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, who was Jewish, David Shribman, and a very, very well-respected newspaperman, who wrote that this anti-Semitic rampage occurred in his words, perhaps the least anti-Semitic city in the country. What does that say to you about this condition of anti-Semitism in America today?
Only that it's as a fringe phenomenon, it's as likely to pop up in what we might think of as unexpected places as in expected places. I mean, it's in a way, it's a somewhat positive message, which is this is a fringe phenomenon. There is no expected place for it to pop up. So it's as likely to pop up in Pittsburgh as in Dallas or San Francisco or rural Mississippi. We are very fortunate in America that there have been very, very few deadly anti-Semitic attacks in our history. I think only 3 violent gun attacks that have claimed 3 lives or more. I mean, it's numerically speaking, it's an almost non-existent phenomenon. However, the fact of contemporary anti-Semitism is that it will pop up anywhere where there's a reach of the internet, which is to say everywhere, that it's not as if there's certain regions that have a lot of it and then certain regions that have none of it. Rather, it's generally, in its deadly form, a non-existent phenomenon. But where there are deranged people looking to scapegoat someone, Jews are going to be a community that they'll reach for and can reach for pretty much anywhere.
And I should add that one feature of contemporary life in America is that whether it's Squirrel Hill or Colleyville, Texas, a little over a year ago, police don't stand by and let anti-Semites have their way with synagogues and Jews. They respond and defend Jews as they would any other citizen. That's
a very important point. That was a point brought home to me by someone I quote in my book, Judge Danny Butler, who's a municipal judge in Pittsburgh, who said, throughout world history, generally agents of the state are seen as coming for the Jews, right? The Tsar's armies were not, you got worried, if you were Jewish, you got worried when agents of the state,
Cossacks weren't coming to protect us.
Right. When armed agents of the state came nearby, you kind of hid. You wanted them to go away. They weren't your friend. And in the contemporary United States, we assume precisely the opposite, that armed agents of the state are there to protect us from people, to guard our lives. And that's largely been true. And that's a very moving thing. That's a tremendous accomplishment that the United States should be proud of.
When we spoke earlier, you told me, thinking of analogies to other countries, that we may be headed toward an anti-Semitism like that of England. And in any case, the condition that has been marked by my entire life, the period since the end of the Second World War, whatever has been true in that period may no longer be true. What do you mean by that?
Right. Well, the years from, say, 1950 to 2000, roughly speaking, were really, really good years for American Jews. They were not only years of relatively unimpeded, sort of a straight ascent of unimpeded progress into the professions, the elite universities, elite social circles, insofar as Jews wanted to join them, country clubs, suburbs that were previously they hadn't been welcome, law firms where previously they couldn't make partner, medical and dental schools that didn't want them. From 1950 to about 2000, all of those barriers that still existed pretty much fell entirely away, and Jews became extremely well liked in public polling. There were several decades where the art and culture of American Jews in classical music, in literature, in film and TV were seen as enriching American culture at large. It was a minority influence that people wanted and that people generally cherished. That doesn't mean there were no stereotypes, but it does mean that it was a very that the stereotypes were as nothing compared to the generally philo-Semitic or Jew-loving atmosphere that pervaded American culture, in some part driven perhaps by guilt over the failure to save American Jews during World War II, when the United States could have done more, I think, and many people think. However, that said, that honeymoon has come to an end, in part because the memory of the Holocaust and sense of responsibility for it has receded, because other groups, other minority groups have quite rightly, received a lot of attention that they weren't getting. And so Jews are seen as less special as contributors to the American melting pot experiment. And also, I would say the kind of unexpected advent of the internet as a real font of the kind of ancient anti-Semitic tropes that have always been with us, but are now kind of being reignited. So yeah, there was a honeymoon, and now there's not.
And our Anglo like future, what might that be?
one of the nice comparisons I think is important to make is that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to get shot all the time. England, for example, has been a place with more anti-Semitism than the United States for centuries. As long as there's been a United States, it's been a useful comparison that England has had more anti-Semitism, it's more pervasive, it's more widely held, and yet it's generally benign from a physical point of view. They don't, for the past 500 years or so, they haven't murdered their Jews. They just have seen them as a little bit, dislikable. And I think that's where we're headed. It wouldn't surprise me if we're headed toward a future in which American Jews are seen, like some other minority groups in America, as generally regrettable, generally dislikable, but not necessarily to be physically eliminated.
So back to the U.S. in the present day, why should there be increases in anti-Semitic incidents? Or for that matter, increases in what the ADL finds in anti-Semitic attitudes?
I think that there's no one explanation. I'm really, really skeptical of monocausal explanations. I think there's a lot of blame to go around. For one thing, I do think that the internet is, as much as we think of it as a cause, we underestimate how much it's a cause of all sorts of coarsening in our public lives. I like to think that I like to remind people that someone like Ye or Kyrie Irving or all sorts of people, Mel Gibson, you name it, who have expressed anti-Semitic views in public 30 or 40 years ago, when their only outlet for their political views was, say, The Tonight Show or The Today Show or People Magazine, they could have said these things once and then they'd never have been invited back on to say them again. And nowadays, if they have Twitter accounts, they can keep saying these things again and again and again. So celebrity toxicity and stupidity is more pervasive and has a wider unmediated audience. I think there's anti-Semitism on the left that tends to suborn these views. I also think there's anti-Semitism on the right. I think that although Trump obviously has Jews whom he's fond of, he also was very, very cavalier in terms of how he talked about Jews publicly throughout his career. I mean, once saying that he wanted, men with funny little hats to be managing his money. That sort of kind of chuckle-headed cavalier anti-Semitism. All these things take their toll. And so the taboo has generally fallen away.
As much as you oppose monocausal explanations, did you equally oppose monocausal remedies? That is, what would you do about this? What's something constructive that we could do?
I'm very chary of offering any remedies except to my fellow Jews. I think of what I tell my children, which is just that their job is to live as robustly and joyfully Jewish a life as possible, to be whom they want to be, whatever that is, and as long as they're physically allowed to do it and nobody's coming for them, which thank goodness is the case in the United States, they need to be proudly and overtly Jewish. I think the history of cultures in which Jews try to quiet themselves in the hope that it will go away is a very, very bloody history, and that doesn't work. The other thing I would say is that I do think we're in the midst of a kind of mass mania and delusion with regard to our relationship to technology. Mm-hmm. And the sooner that Twitter self-destructs and that other forms of social media become things that we put back in their place, and we're able to sort of consume media and thought and ideas, perhaps with the temperament and the metabolism of 30 or 40 years ago, I think that the sooner a lot of these prejudices will subside a bit.
Well, Mark Oppenheimer, stick with us because we're going to have the question and answer session in a little while. But thank you, Mark Oppenheimer. Our second panelist, Dara Horn, is a scholar, essayist, and novelist. She has a PhD from Harvard in comparative literature, in particular Yiddish and Hebrew literature. She has also taught at Harvard as well as at Yeshiva University, Sarah Lawrence, and City University of New York. A collection of her essays, People Love Dead Jews, is a very insightful and provocative book. Her point is not that people, you can tell me if I'm misrepresenting you, it's not that people like the idea of genocide or prefer it, but rather that accounts of Jewish tragedies tend to search for universal implications of anti-Semitic acts, and the specific victimization of Jews because they are Jews gets minimized or lost in the process. Anne Frank becomes every girl as opposed to a Jewish girl who was killed because she was Jewish, and she's not around to correct the record. Dara Horn, I haven't done justice perhaps to your thesis, but welcome and thanks for doing this today.
Thanks for having me.
First, what do you make of the current rise in anti-Semitism, and why do you think it's happening?
It's a great question. I think that what's been said earlier, that this is, in a sense, a regression to a norm, makes a lot of sense to me. I think that there's you had a couple of generations of a non-Jewish public who were chagrined by the enormity of the Holocaust, and now that memory as something that people think of as something that's present in their lives is really fading with the death of that generation, I think that we're really seeing a regression to a norm. In a sense, like what we're seeing now is kind of normal, which is really depressing to think, but I think it's true. In terms of what we're seeing, I wrote this book, People Love Dead Jews. As you said, it's not a book in favor of genocide. This is a book that's it basically is the thesis is twofold. It's that people tell stories about dead Jews that make them feel better about themselves. And the corollary to that is that living Jews have to erase themselves in order to gain public respect. And I do trace that, as you say, through Holocaust commemoration. There's the example of the young Jewish man who was working at the Anne Frank Museum in Amsterdam, and his employer would not allow him to wear his yarmulke to work. They made him hide it under a baseball hat. He appealed this decision to the board of the museum. The board of the museum then deliberated for 4 months and then finally let this young man wear his yarmulke to work. And as I say in the book, 4 months is a really long time for the Anne Frank house to ponder whether or not it was a good idea to force a Jew into hiding, right? So there's this sort of piety that's expressed toward this, historical aspects of Jewish life. And I want to say it's not just about the Holocaust. I have chapters in it about Jewish heritage sites, places around the world that used to have robust Jewish communities and don't anymore, don't even bother telling you why. And pining for Jewish tourism. I also discuss it in a lot of aspects of American culture, past and present. So, which to bring us to the present. So what happened when I published this book, and what really has surprised me is responses that I've gotten from non-Jewish readers, which have been very positive and have given me a lot of hope for the future. But what's shocked me is responses I've gotten from my Jewish readers. These are people from all walks of life: old people, young people, religious, secular, people from large, small communities. And they all basically were telling me exactly the same thing, which was, I've been uncomfortable my whole life. I never understood why. Your book articulated this for me. Thank you. And then they would say, I never told anyone this before, but. And then they tell me some horror story from their own life of experiences they've had with anti-Semitism. And what I've really found remarkable about this is that what they're sharing with me are not the kind of things that make it into like some FBI hate crime statistics, right? These are like personal experiences, small humiliations, things that come from people at work, something that comes from people at school, something that comes from even from, romantic partners, relatives and family and friends. I have sort of been shocked by the level of these kinds of things that my readers are telling me about. One simple example, I can't get over how many people are having pennies thrown at them in 21st century America. I thought that had died in 1952, but apparently not. So, I think it's really disturbing. And I do see it as kind of a regression to the norm.
You raised the idea, I believe you raised the idea that perhaps with the degree of Holocaust memorialization and education, perhaps the American Jewish community has set the bar too low for what is acceptable tolerance of other people, and that don't be a Nazi, don't become a concentration camp guard, try and hide somebody if they're coming to kill people in your neighborhood it doesn't address the kind of incidents that people are reporting now and that they're finding. They suggest that you're not wanted in this country, or they suggest that you're not the way you should be.
Yes. Well, so this is something that I do write about it in the book. And I also have I've been working on, I have a long form piece that's coming out in the Atlantic in a couple of months that I did a piece for them about Holocaust education in America. And yes, what I determined from that, and it's not just my determination, just observing, it's also like research. People often are using Holocaust education as a way of trying to prevent anti-Semitism. I mean, I could go through the data here with you. I don't want to take up your time. This doesn't seem to be an effective way to prevent people from being anti-Semitic, because, as you say, we do this public ritual now where some public figure says something anti-Semitic, and then they're taken to a Holocaust museum, and then they have to make a public statement that Nazis are bad. As you say, that's a low bar to clear. What this has done for a large percentage of the American population who really have no other exposure to Jews other than what they learn in school, because there aren't a whole lot of Jews in America. For those who the only thing they learned in school, the only thing they're learning in school about Jews is that they got murdered in the Holocaust. Yeah. That's the only thing. And so then what we've done is you've set the bar for what is anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is defined as genocide in the past. Mm-hmm. This does not give people any tools for understanding, what anti-Semitism really is. And the other piece of it, and this is, I think, a sort of part of a strategy that an earlier generation of American Jews used in confronting this, was even in teaching about the Holocaust, there was this idea of teaching. The way that we would teach about people about bigotry was we would teach people that, oh, see this group of people over here that you might be bigoted against. You shouldn't hate those people because they're just like you and me. They're just like everyone else. Mm-hmm. And the problem with this idea is that Jews spent 3,000 years not being like everyone else. Right? I mean, that's sort of like, almost like, uncoolness is Judaism's brand, right? I mean, we've been uncool since the ancient world. We were like worshiping the bossy, unsexy, invisible God. Like, we've never been cool. And I think the problem with this is that what you're then teaching people is you're teaching them that, the reason you shouldn't hate someone else is because they're just like you. Not to respect difference. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Well, I was going to say, is it at all surprising that the vast majority of violent attacks on American Jews today are against visibly, as you say, visibly religious Jews? Because, if we're teaching people don't hate someone because they're just like you and me, then suddenly it's totally fine to attack them if they have a weird hairstyle.
I just want, before we move on, and you'll come back and we'll talk longer. Just one thing I'd like you to elaborate on, which is your idea about erasure. Is to my reading, it's a fairly dark reading of American Jewish history, which is that the trade-off has been, yes, you're welcome here, but you have to erase your Jewishness to a great extent. Whereas I found myself reading that lots of Jews emigrated to America and delighted in a certain degree of erasure, and were quite happy to live lives very different from the Orthodox tradition they'd been raised in. Say, you could take a long time answering that question. Yes. I want the short version.
So, yes, I'm sorry, I'm a bit long-winded, but the short form is, the short version is, I have a section in the book about the legend of Ellis Island that many American Jews have heard. They're like, oh, there's this bumbling cork at Ellis Island who changed her name. Spoiler, it never happened. American Jews and their children, generation after the mass migration, went to court to change their names. Yeah. Why did they go to court to change their names? It wasn't because they hated being Jewish and were running away from involvement in the Jewish community. The historian Kirsten Vermeglich has a whole book about this called A Rosenberg by Any Other Name. Yeah. She tracks these people. These people, like, they went back to their synagogue and said, I'm now going to pay my dues under this name. These were not people running away from Jewish life. They were staring down a reality that they couldn't avoid. And that reality was American anti-Semitism. And this is a reality that we have buried in our collective consciousness, I think. And I think that, a lot American Jews are very attached to the idea of American exceptionalism, that this is a total exception to Jewish history. Obviously, it's a lot better than a lot of places in Jewish history, but I think that we have invested a lot in burying that. And so when you say Jews are happy to erase themselves, I think a lot of people have inherited from their parents whatever their parents gave them of Jewish tradition, which in a lot of cases was nothing. And the choice to give your children nothing did not come from nowhere.
No, I don't want to belabor this, but I was thinking of Deborah Tannen, whose memoir I read recently, and her father came as a boy from Warsaw to New York, and his stories of hating Cheder so much were that he never wanted to have anything to do with that. Considered himself a Jew, but very much a secular one. Anyway, we have much more to talk about, so hang in here with us, and we'll come back in 10 minutes. Dara Horn, thank you so much. Our third panelist is Rabbi David Fox Sandmel. Rabbi Sandmel is the chairman of the International Committee for Interreligious Consultations. The committee, which is comprised of 11 organizations, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, most from the U.S., but not all. Its mission is to interact with other international religious bodies. So they're the official representatives of the Jewish people to the Vatican and the World Evangelical Alliance. Rabbi Sandmel, thanks for taking part today.
Well, thank you.
And first, from the vantage point of the committee that you chair, where you're dealing with leaders of other religious communities, are there any parallels to the kind of anti-Semitic incidents we see on the rise in the U.S., or is the news good up there?
Well, first of all, I think that it varies from country to country in terms of anti-Semitic incidents. When it comes to the leadership of international, specifically international Christian organizations, at the leadership level, we have Pope Francis, for example, or the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, and people in those sorts of positions who have been very clear in their rejection of anti-Semitism. And when there is some sort of an incident, they will speak up. So these are people who are very firmly supportive of the Jewish community and deeply concerned about anti-Semitism. What is more problematic, I think, is the fact that even with these formal statements and statements from people in leadership positions, anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism can still be found within various Christian denominations, in part because some of it is quite subtle. And so it's one thing for the Catholic Church to reject anti-Semitism. It's another thing for the Catholic Church to understand exactly in what subtle ways it continues to be expressed in teaching or in preaching. And I singled out the Catholic Church, but it's not unique in that regard.
Mm-hmm. But it sounds like we've come a long way from the days of the future Pope Pius XII during the 1930s and 40s. I mean, there obviously Vatican II changed a tremendous amount, and the change has continued.
Yes, and we see these when the World Council of Churches was founded in 1948. It described anti-Semitism as sin against man and God in the language that they used at that point in time. You will find the World Evangelical Alliance recently, actually it was the European Evangelical Alliance recently endorsed the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. So again, on that sort of overarching level, you're hearing the right thing. The question is, what is being taught in seminaries or in religious schools? How are people teaching about the passion of Jesus? How are they teaching about the passages that refer to the Pharisees in unflattering ways? And this really gets to how do we deal with the fact that these anti-Jewish beliefs and ideas are woven into the fabric of Western culture. Mm-hmm. And so how do we become aware? How do we help people become aware of these biases in the same way that I've been helped to become aware of biases that I absorbed in my life, right. Whether it was about women or about people of color or the LGBTQ community. You know, it's one thing to say, yes, racism is bad. It's another thing to understand how it continues to operate. And the same goes, I think, for anti-Semitism.
What do you make? Why do you think, on a lower level, are the shootings? Should we see them as sadly typical of a country in which there are too many shootings? And what's your read of the current rise in anti-Semitism?
Well, I think that Mark referred to the coarsening of our public discourse. Mm-hmm. Which then is amplified by the internet, which then is also amplified by the divisiveness that we see politically in our country, sort of the breaking up into different groups, all of whom are I'm 100% right and everybody else is 100% wrong. Right. I think that we are continuing to see some of the grievances of people being left behind by the economy that began in 2008, if not earlier. So people looking for someone to blame, someone to hold responsible. And this is, unfortunately, a classic role that Jews have played. And there are probably some other factors that I could name as well, but there are a myriad of factors here.
You know, I mentioned at the outset the Anti-Defamation League survey, and only two of the statements that they presented people with drew a majority of people agreeing. Remarkably, the one that 70% of the respondents agreed with was that Jews stick together more than other Americans, which, in other words, were insufficiently fractious, I suppose. Which, at a time when most Jews are marrying non-Jews, it seems to me to be an odd observation, but that's true. The next one, 53%, was Jews hire other Jews in business. People agreed, 53% agreed with that. 39% of the people agreed with the statement that Jews are more loyal to Israel than to the U.S. In your dealings with international bodies, where does Israel loom in discussions of what's anti-Semitism, what's an opinion about politics? What do you hear?
Well, the issue of Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is very significant for some of the folks with whom we're in conversation. The World Council of Churches is always part of their agenda, in part because they have constituents, Arab Christians living either in Israel or the West Bank or more broadly in the area. And so they rightly are concerned about their own co-religionists. And so that becomes part of the dialogue. One of the challenges in talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is, again, the fact that this anti-Judaism is built into Western culture, Western society, means that the rhetoric, the terminology that has been classically used against Jews and against Judaism is easily transferable to talking about Israel and the things that Israel does. Some people have identified anti-Israel sentiment as the new anti-Semitism. I think that needs to be unpacked, but it is worth noting. I think there is a phenomenon that when people perceive that Jews are acting badly, whether they are or not, but Israel is an example of that, it gives them an opportunity to say, see, they're not so special in this regard, going back to the other phrase, they're just like everybody else. Yeah. So it becomes, there is certainly legitimate criticism of Israel. I could give you my list if you'd like at some point in time, but the ways in which people talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict often move out of the legitimate political discourse realm into the realm of anti-Semitism.
The fact that Kanye West, or Ye as he's now known, and Kyrie Irving are both black, as well as I believe the assailants of who attacked Hasidic Jews in Jersey City were. These have prompted some concerns that the venerable, if sometimes difficult, political alliance between Jewish Americans and blacks may be coming undone. What has your experience been on that score?
Well, on the one hand, it's been coming undone since the late 1960s and the collapse of the New Left. So this isn't exactly news. Yeah. On the other, at the same time, I wouldn't necessarily say that the examples that you give are representative of the Black community in America, and I can point to many instances, both on the local and on the national level, of the Jewish community and the Black community working really hand in glove, and seeing that while there are certainly differences in the histories and there are differences in the way racism and anti-Semitism express themselves, there is a certain commonality there and a sense of shared destiny. So and I'm not sure that there's any less Jewish racism in the Jewish community than there is anti-Semitism in the Black community. So I would be leery of picking examples and saying that those are representative.
Rabbi Sandmel, thank you very much. I'm going to call back our other panelists right now, Mark Oppenheimer and Dara, and we'll begin our discussion. First, I just wanted to go around and ask each of you if there's something you've heard from your fellow panelists that you'd like to comment on briefly, starting with Mark, since you went first.
just most recently, I think it's at the top of my head because Rabbi Sandmel just said it, the idea of alliances. We are many generations into the idea that Jews are naturally creatures of the Democratic Party, that they have natural alliances with African Americans and other historically marginalized groups. I think the most important thing that I always think about when I think about Jews, and this touches a little bit on what Dara was saying as well, is that yes, they very much, increasingly, they are American, right? As they are like other humans in that the longer any minority group is in America, the less they begin to resemble whatever sort of ancestral heritage they brought with them, and the more they resemble America. That doesn't mean that they don't retain particularities, often want to retain particularities, whether from African American culture, Jewish culture, Hispanic culture, you name it. But the fundamental fact of America is that it's an extraordinary solvent. The children who grow up in America within one generation want to know more about basketball and video games and McDonald's than they do about whatever was in the old country. And this is, for better or for worse. If you're trying to raise kids who care about their Jewish heritage and you're fighting against, American mass culture. And so, the truth about, I laugh when you bring up things, and I know you didn't, you brought it up because the ADL polls on it, but questions about, are Jews more likely to hire other Jews? First of all, most of us aren't bosses. I don't get to hire I don't get to hire anybody. Right. Dara and I, we don't have a lot of employees in our lives as freelance writers. But so, but if I were to, would I be more likely to hire someone Jewish? I'd want to hire, someone competent and someone who was, 23 years old, but didn't need Grammarly to punctuate. And so, it's funny to think that we're still living in this world in which we're sort of parsing for these particularities, and do Jews still ally with blacks or not? I mean, it's 2023, and most people have a very, very tenuous sense of their ethnic or racial particularity anyway.
Dara?
Lots to think about. I think that to that question of Rabbi Sandmel spoke about and what Mark just spoke about now about, basically sort of relationships with different groups in the United States. One thing that I have noticed, and which has sort of been a more positive thing that I've gotten out of traveling around the country, speaking about this book and speaking with readers from a lot of different backgrounds, is the response I've gotten from non-Jewish readers. Which has really honestly surprised me. I have basically discovered that there's a few different things. One is to the point about other minority groups. What I have found is the most common response to my work from other people in other minority groups is, wow, you're speaking my language. And this is such a common, there's so many elements of it that are a common experience. I even had a woman who contacted me from, who was a principal of a high school in Canada that's mostly serves Indigenous students. And she said she wanted copies of this book for her entire school. Because she's like, my student, and I'm like, I can think of better ways for you to spend your money. But her point was that she's like, my students, she's like, this is the dynamic my students are dealing with. It's like this sort of, this idea of like, there's this love for this history, and there's all this, ostensible respect for this history, but then like the living people are basically irrelevant. We don't really care about them, and we don't, and we don't take them seriously. So that's something that I've heard from readers from many minority groups. The other thing that I've heard from readers in general, including those from other minority groups, is basically reading about this Jewish experience and being like, I had no idea. And I think the reason they have no idea is, number one, there aren't a whole lot of Jews in America. But the response is basically, these are people who have a lot of goodwill, want to, in the parlance of today, be good allies, and maybe don't know how. This goes to what Rabbi Sandmel said about like, people are like, yes, officially we put out the statement, we are not anti-Semitic, but then it's like people don't understand how to unpack maybe what they've grown up with or the background that they've had. A lot of people just don't know anything at all. And it's sort of amazing to me how little you have to teach someone or even just share with them in order for some people to, to see what we're dealing with and how to address it. There is so much untapped goodwill in this country that I think is really worth pursuing. And that's something that I find actually really hard.
And Rabbi Sandmel, thoughts on what you've heard from your fellow panelists?
Well, I've heard a lot, so I'm going to try to pick the best thing to respond to here. I would agree that perhaps if I may borrow a little or paraphrase the title of your book, people know dead Jews, but they don't know live Jews. and they don't know what it means for someone today to be Jewish and the many different ways that that is expressed. I would also just say that I think that there are some very interesting new developments in the community and the ways that people are connecting to their Jewishness and expressing their Jewishness that I think many in the Jewish community aren't even aware of. The comment that was made a little while ago about agents of the state playing the role of being protectors rather than perpetrators, I think is very important. And I think that, we and you mentioned that Dara, you mentioned that people tend to think very positively of Jews. When something happens, the vast bulk of the community, whether it's civic leaders, religious leaders, political leaders, they're all out there sort of defending the Jewish community. And that's a good thing. I have this little, in the back of my head saying, well, let's just pay attention to what's going on, for example, in state legislatures. If they're starting to control what women can wear in the state house somewhere, where does it go? Now, I realize that's sort of the old Jewish joke about the telegram, start worrying, details to follow. But I think I'm not an alarmist, but I also think we need to pay attention to what's going on around us. And the last thing that I would say here is that even with the amount, or the percentages of anti-Semitism and so forth that show up in the ADL polling and so forth, most of those people are not going to become mass killers. But all it takes is one to perpetrate a horrendous act. And as that number of people who hold those ideologies grows, again, the infinitesimal number that are actually going to take a gun and do something, that grows too. And that's why it doesn't really matter where you are, but wherever Jews are, we are, whether we like it or not, we are targets.
Well, here are some questions that have been sent to us. First, this one is from Martin Kagan, who's listening. He asks, does any of the panelists think that current anti-Semitism will result in significant aliyah, immigration to Israel, outside of the Orthodox community? I wanted to start with Mark in answering that, because you did remark on the how little was changed in the community of Squirrel Hill after the attack.
So we have some data on this, I think, and maybe David probably knows best of all, but Dara might also know more than I do. But we're 4 or 5 years into public discussion of the uptick in anti-Semitism, particularly in France, where there was a lot of violence. And I think there is substantially increased aliyah from France, if I'm not mistaken, but almost nowhere else. And as well as countries where there is economic unrest. I think that Russia has said, Ukraine has seen an uptick in aliyah in the last year, but not the United States, as far as I know. And in fact, I've talked to people who work on trying to create more olim, more people moving to Israel, who have said, we just can't move the needle in the United States, no matter what happens in current events.
David, I see you nodding agreement.
My sense is that the perception is that it's not bad enough yet to to motivate people to make that kind of move.
Yeah,
Dara?
and the other piece of this is that the French example is kind of interesting, because that's a situation where there's that community has really been dramatically reduced, and there's been an enormous aliyah to Israel, and that's it is because of sort of this ongoing violence. But what I think is interesting about that is that example doesn't fit the idea that some of people talked about earlier about state agency, right? That isn't a situation where it's because the government is persecuting these people, they're all moving to Israel. The French example is an example of a situation where, there's all kinds of official goodwill, but there was just became intolerable for people to raise their children there, because for a lot of families, because it was just too many violent attacks. And this was really on the level of street violence. What I think is interesting is that you do see a lot of that kind of street violence, for example, in Brooklyn, in Hasidic communities.
Yeah.
And that's something, we didn't really talk about that much, but I think that's those are communities that are seeing a lot more violence. Like, I don't think we're just looking at 3 well-publicized shootings. And I think the other important thing about that is, I think both panelists, other panelists mentioned that, when something terrible happens, there's this wonderful, public support. And certainly, Mark's book about Pittsburgh documented that really beautifully. Unfortunately, I don't think that's what's happening when you see violent attacks against Hasidim and people in the Haredi community. Unfortunately, I don't think that you see that. I think you see a lot of excuse making and a lot of victim blaming. And that I find really disturbing.
I mean, I think that's true. But to be clear, I completely agree. And I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, that it's really the example of Brooklyn. There have been scattered incidences. There was, an incident or two that were well publicized in Los Angeles. But really what you're talking about is and there was the shooting in Jersey City, but the ongoing sort of relentless drumbeat of violence is a Brooklyn problem that the New York City political establishment and police have failed to address. Though I would also say, France, is interesting because although there's official goodwill, I actually think a lot of French Jews felt that there wasn't a lot of allyship, that in fact their Gentile, nominally Catholic, but largely secular neighbors really thought this is a problem between Jews and Arabs and don't care as much as we like to think our neighbors in New Jersey and Connecticut would care if we were.
Well, except that I feel like if you talk to people in Lakewood, I don't think they're seeing a whole lot of allyship either.
Well, there
have been violent attacks in Lakewood. So, I mean, and they're not very well reported. Yeah.
And I think that's why the questioner asked apart from Orthodox about it.
Yeah.
And one could ask, by the way, similarly, whether...
But wait, can I make a point here? This is actually, sorry, I wanted to make this point earlier. We were talking about whether you both talked, Dara and David both talked really nicely about the question of do they know contemporary Jews? And all these people said, I don't know any of you. People know fewer Jews than they did 50 years ago. And that's partly because a lot of American towns that had small Jewish populations have emptied out of their Jews, which is why there are hundreds of temples and synagogues closing across the country. And also because Orthodox Jews, and this is not this is neither bad nor good, Orthodox Jews and sort of conservative leaning, or conservadox Jews, you might say, or just Israeli Americans have moved into Jewish day schools and out of the public schools, and have moved to a smaller number of universities where they feel they'll be supported and get kosher food and have good Hillel establishments that'll support them. But and the professions in which a lot of these Jews work, I mean, the New York City public schools, everyone used to have several Jewish teachers, or dozens in 12 years in the New York City public schools. And that is substantially reduced these days. There were just enormous opportunities for interface with Jewish public servants when Jews were in these middle-class municipal jobs that we don't go into as much anymore. And then the observant members of our community, and I have children in Jewish day schools myself, I'd say, often don't send our children to the public schools as much or for as long. So there actually are much larger swaths of America that just don't meet Jews, even though our numbers have ticked upwards.
I want to read you a comment from a viewer, Nancy Wadler, who wrote rather obviously angrily, "How can you be so naive? There has always been anti-Semitism. There will always be anti-Semitism. Just as uneducated people have a narrow perspective, they rejoiced as Trump opened up the Pandora's box of all sorts of hatred. The internet enables hatred to flow and travel worldwide. It enables crazies of all kinds to find like-minded people." Is Nancy Wadler extreme in her view of things, Rabbi Sandmel?
Well, I might politely disagree. I don't think that any of the three of us has been naive. But that aside, yes, there has always been anti-Semitism. Again, I'm not sure that I would limit it to the uneducated as well.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's necessarily a correlation there. It is, as I said earlier, it is woven into the fabric of Western society. So we shouldn't be surprised. And I think, just to underscore something that Dara said earlier, we focus on the big events, but if you take a look at polling, I think ADL does some of this polling as well, attitudes of that and the experiences of American Jews. So I don't remember the numbers, but a very high percent of American Jews report having experienced personally anti-Semitism in the recent past. And these are not only those Jews who are visible and being attacked on the street. You talked about the, pennies being thrown at kids. This happens in grade schools around the country. I live in Maine. The Hanukkah menorah in Rockland, Maine was toppled over. I mean, these are, I think that Jews in America experience these, again, not life-changing, but just at the very least, unpleasantness, and then it goes from there. Talk to students on campus and what they're hearing in their dorms and in their classes. I get it. I'm not saying that every campus in America is a hotbed of anti-Semitism, but again, being exposed to and being the target of anti-Semitism is just part of what it means to identify as a Jew in America.
I want to say something about the naivete point, though. Mm-hmm. I think that naivete, which I agree that I don't think that the three of us expressed this, but
maybe she meant me. Maybe my question. I don't know it.
I think that it's very common among American Jews in general, because I think that American Jews, as I said earlier, are very attached to this idea of America being an exception to Jewish history. This is like a deep, almost like a religious level belief for a lot of American Jews. And I think that, and what I found is when people would tell me these horrible experiences that they had, they would tell them to me privately. They were almost ashamed of them. Mm. And it's amazing to me, what I've seen is how much minimizing American Jews do of these experiences. I even see myself doing it. Like, often people ask me, like, well, have you experienced this? And I'm like, oh no, I've never experienced like that. And then I'm like, wait a minute. Last year, one of my events was threatened. Somebody wanted to kill me at my event, and they had to have police presence show up at my book reading. Like, to me, I'm like, oh, whatever, it happens. I'm a public figure. It's like, no, I don't think that happens normally to public. Like, I'm not Salman Rushdie, right? I'm not that cool.
No one's doing that.
Honestly, this is not like a normal thing to happen to writers. I'm like, I'm not even that cool. So anyway, yes, I think there is a little naivety.
Doesn't happen to Methodists.
Probably for your writing on the Merchant event, it's probably the Shakespeare Liberation Front that's strengthening your events. Here's a question that was sent in earlier. I have a college-age child at a university, and her response to anti-Jewish feelings is to go undercover. How can we help my daughter be proud of who she is? Who wants to answer that? But Mark Oppenheimer.
I just spoke the other night to the Jewish Grandparents Network, which is a living and very
the Jewish Grandparents Network?
Yeah, it's a really interesting organization that has just been founded by some really terrific Jewish communal professionals, basically saying to grandparents how to help your children and grandchildren, because grandparents often have time and money and Jewish knowledge that their children and grandchildren don't need, or that they need. I actually only have one answer to this, and it's not so useful if your child has already left home. But if you are raising children, raise them to be Jewishly knowledgeable, raise them to believe that they are the aristocratic heirs to 3,000 years of an intergenerational book club that gave the world ethical monotheism. I mean, raise them to understand what an extraordinary thing it is to be a Jew. And I do think that allows them a kind of adaptive, protective, slightly chipped Teflon coating when they encounter, hatred directed toward them. Because they think that anti-Semitism is an absurdity that says more about the perpetrator than about them. Yeah. So that's the only thing that really works. I think there are probably other policy level, bits of advice you could give campus security, but I'm not expert in those.
Dara, you've written that actually there should be that kind of education about what the Jewish contribution to civilization has been for everybody. That it should be part of what kids learn.
Yes, actually, yes. I think that everybody needs a basic Jewish education, Jews and non-Jews. Because if you think about what's in a high school history textbook about Jews, basically there's a chapter toward the end about the Holocaust, from which we learn that Jews got murdered. The murderers are there to teach us some lesson about humanity. And that's the only thing in the book. That's it. So it's like, that this is an anti-Semitic erasure of Jews from Western civilization.
Doesn't the Inquisition make it for a paragraph somewhere?
No, I don't think even that. I mean, maybe, I don't know. I don't think so. But even if that was the Inquisition, same problem as the Holocaust. Like, we're not learning anything about the content of Jewish civilization. I just spoke a couple months ago. I was at one of these like corporate DEI events in Kansas City, and somebody there was telling me how the most recent stupid thing that happened in their town was somebody standing on whatever the busiest street corner is in Kansas City, holding a giant sign that said, "It's the Jews." Mm-hmm. And they're like, obviously this is an anti-Semitic provocation. And I said, well, yes, on our planet it is. But imagine an alternate universe where the guy who's holding a sign that says, "It's the Jews," what he means by that is, it's the Jews, they invented the weekend. Right? Like, why aren't these the things people know about Jews? Like,
meanwhile, be careful. Be careful what you wish for. You should hear what the public school teacher who taught Jewish Week at my daughter's middle school told them about Jews. I mean, a well-meaning but ill-informed interlude of Jewish history. I mean, that part of the problem, as you know, as you're writing about, is we don't have a core of well-educated, even highly educated people often are not competent to teach Jewish Week. So we have work to do.
Yes. There's a basic problem. I mean, and to go to that the question though about the person who's erasing themselves, this is in college. This is a classic strategy among diaspora Jews, right? I call this in my book Hanukkah anti-Semitism, like this need to sort of erase yourself in order to gain public respect. That's a classic sort of strategy. But one thing I found is, like, especially when I speak about this on college campuses, you just sort of have to tweak the language that you use to explain this to people. Like, one thing that I've often people will often ask me on college campuses, they'll say this something like, "Oh, well, Jews are white, so they never experienced bigotry." Yeah. I'm like, my answer to that is there's 10 things wrong with that statement. I'm not going to unpack them all for you now, right. But I assume you then also feel that white people in the LGBTQ community never experience bigotry because they can just hang out in the closet. And suddenly when you frame it that way, people just get it. Another thing that I've often done is speaking about, like, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. There's a lot of history to that we don't have time for, but one thing I often will use that same analogy. I say, so you probably would also say to people in the LGBTQ community, "We love you and we're not homophobic at all, and we're fully accepting of you, and we're so thrilled that you're part of our community. Never bring your partner with you in public anywhere ever. We love you." In other words, it's like me saying, like, I, as a person who's not part of this community, I get to decide how you express your identity. And it's like, when you frame it for that way for people really do get it. Like, it's really not that hard to explain this to people.
David Sandmel, thoughts about this?
Yes.
Well, there are, in terms of responding to anti-Semitism, sort of in the moment, there's some strategies that people can learn. The problem is that they're only probably going to learn them in some sort of a Jewish institution, in a day school or in a synagogue youth group program. And, I'm guessing that the majority of American, teenagers, whatever, are not in those programs. And so they show up, say, at a college campus with no strategies and no understanding. And then they're sort of gobsmacked when something like this happens. And, you have to have sympathy for someone who doesn't want to put themselves out and be at risk. So, how do you make it possible for them to be proud while perhaps they still want to be a little careful about exposing themselves?
We have time for, I think, one more question that I'll just pass around to each of you, which is about social media. We've heard about the role of the internet and modern communications, which I think Mark held out the hope that somehow this will become normalized, or we'll be able to handle it better. But it's not going away. The communications are not going to get any slower, or perhaps they'll get more thoughtful. I don't know. How far would each of you be willing to go to control hateful discourse on social media? Is it time for the government to censor what people try to communicate on it? Is that a value that we prize too highly to compromise, even in the name of combating anti-Semitism? David, what do you think?
Well, I'm not going to answer that question directly, but I am going to say that as long as there's money to be made, that will be a determining factor. and that people who either are responsible to their own bottom line or to the bottom line of their companies are going to be very leery about putting the brakes on anything that's generating cash.
And Dara?
I am never going to stand up for anything involving censorship, because I just don't think that you win that way. I don't think you win ever, but I don't think anybody ever wins anything. But I don't think that that's the way to go. Actually, it's interesting. In this piece I wrote for The Atlantic, one of the things I was researching in the beginnings of American Holocaust education is the Nazis in Skokie incident, which the older viewers will immediately recognize what that is. This was like Nazis who wanted to march in their neo-Nazis who wanted to do like a march in their uniforms in Skokie, Illinois, suburb, Chicago suburb with a huge Jewish population, and a lot of at that time survivors. This is in 1977. Yeah. The town tried to block the march in every possible way. It went to the Supreme Court. Basically, the law sided with the Nazis because of the First Amendment, and that's the point where the survivor community pivots to education as a way to combat this. It basically was because of they saw that you're not going to win this in court, so to speak, and nor do I think people should. But I do think, but what to that point about social media is sort of like, open up this like Pandora's box and all that. This is a real old problem. I write about this in my book about new media spreading anti-Semitism. This has been a problem. Yeah. I write about this in the case of Simon of Trent, who was a child who was he was found as a kid whose body was found in the city of Trent in Italy, and the whole city's Jewish population was accused of murdering him and using his blood to make matzah. This is like a medieval blood libel. Yeah. This happened at around the same time, not that long before the burgeoning of printing presses. I was actually surprised to learn that I think it was more than half of the first books that were printed in Italy for the first 10 years of the printing press were about Jews butchering and eating this child. So new media spreading lies. Well, this isn't a new problem, if that's any comfort. I don't know that it is.
And Mark, you have the last word.
I don't have a lot of, I didn't mean to tell people that I had a lot of optimism. I think that tempering and getting used to social media and figuring out how to use it, and rather than to be used by it, is work that we need to do. I have no hope that government commissars or post-collegians hired to be a fleet of in-house censors at social media companies are the way to go. I'm not terribly concerned about Twitter becoming more of a cesspool. I already thought it was a cesspool, and thoughtful people would never spend time on it. We have finite hours on Earth, so it's not a good way, not a thoughtful way that a mature person spends time is following social media. And I think we have to learn that. So no, I agree. I don't hold any hope for censorship as the way to go. I think that what Dara points out does hold, a glimmer of optimism, which is that new media tend to be, they tend to gravitate, they tend to polarize, and they gravitate to extremes, and they are often taken up by very highly energetic and smart but misguided people. It was Father Coughlin used radio, which was not so new at the time, but so I think that it will be less of a problem 20 or 30 years from now for various reasons, but I don't think that sort of highly refined censorship will be the reason why.
Mark Oppenheimer, thank you very much for being with us today. And thanks to Dara Horn and also to Rabbi David Fox Sandmel. You've been great. Also, many thanks to Joshua Plout, Roni Javelliano, Adrian Kiss from American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, which produces Global Connections, and thanks to our technical director, Bobby Grandone. Our program sponsor is the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. It's a 501c3 national charitable organization. It represents in the U.S. Israel's largest hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petach Tikva in Greater Tel Aviv. The website of the group is www.afrmc.org. Join us next month for Ukraine. How will this war end? Our guests will include columnist David Ignatius of the Washington Post and William Taylor, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. And looking still further ahead in March, our topic will be the future of U.S.-Israeli relations with panelists David Makovsky of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, Lucy Kurtzer-Ellenbogen of the U.S. Institute for Peace, and former U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Martin Indyk. I'm Robert Siegel, and this has been Global Connections, Navigating the New Normal. See you next month. Stay healthy and stay safe.